Sir, people like you do not qualify for loans this size, so let us not waste each other's time. The words landed across the marble lobby of First Dominion Bank loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Even the clicking of keyboards seemed to slow for a moment. Standing calmly in front of the commercial lending desk was Ethan Brooks, a black CEO whose tailored charcoal suit looked simple rather than flashy, the kind of suit worn by someone who no longer needed to impress strangers. Across from him stood Richard Collins, the bank's senior branch manager, a man whose confidence had grown from 20 years of deciding who deserved financial opportunities and who did not. Ethan glanced at the loan application folder resting on the desk between them. Richard had barely opened it. He had skimmed the first page, looked Ethan up and down, and already reached a conclusion. Around them, customers pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here. Now, back to Ethan Brooks. Ethan's expression never changed. You have not reviewed the application. Richard folded his arms. I have reviewed enough. A younger employee seated nearby shifted uncomfortably. She had seen applications rejected before, but usually after financial records were examined. Richard continued. The amount requested is substantial. Our institution has standards. Ethan nodded slowly. I would imagine it does. Richard interpreted the response as surrender and grew even more confident. Perhaps a smaller community lender would be a better fit. Several customers exchanged glances. Something about the interaction felt wrong. Ethan was not dressed like someone struggling financially. He was not nervous. He was not defensive. Most applicants denied a major loan showed frustration or disappointment. Ethan showed neither. Instead, he simply stood there studying the room, as if observing something larger than the conversation itself. Richard pushed the folder slightly across the desk. I am afraid this meeting is over. Ethan looked down at the folder, but did not touch it. Then he looked around the lobby. Tall windows allowed sunlight to pour across polished floors. Promotional banners advertised opportunity, trust, and financial partnership. One framed statement mounted near the entrance read, "We believe every customer deserves respect." Ethan's eyes lingered on the sign for a second before returning to Richard. Interesting. Richard frowned. Excuse me. Nothing. Ethan offered a polite smile. Thank you for your time. The response caught Richard off guard. He had expected resistance. He had expected arguments. Instead, Ethan picked up his folder and walked away without another word. Several employees watched him move across the lobby. Rather than leaving the building, he chose a seat in the customer waiting area near a large indoor fountain. He sat down calmly and placed the folder beside him. Richard shook his head and returned to his desk. In his mind, the matter was finished. Yet the younger employee could not stop thinking about the encounter. She glanced toward Ethan several times over the next few minutes. Most rejected applicants left immediately. Ethan remained perfectly relaxed. He checked no emails, made no angry phone calls. He simply observed the activity around him. Across the lobby, a wealthy real estate developer arrived and received immediate attention. Two employees greeted him by name before he even reached the desk. Minutes later, another executive customer entered and was escorted directly to a private office. Ethan watched every interaction quietly. The longer he sat there, the more he seemed like a man conducting research rather than waiting. Upstairs, in offices overlooking the lobby, regional staff prepared reports for an upcoming board review. Numbers, portfolios, and strategic accounts filled their screens. None of them knew that a seemingly routine encounter downstairs was about to create a chain reaction throughout the organization. Back in the lobby, Richard laughed with another manager about the morning's workload. He never once looked toward the waiting area. If he had, he might have noticed something unusual. One of the commercial banking analysts had just entered the lobby carrying a stack of account files. As she walked past Ethan, she casually glanced at the folder resting beside him. Her eyes widened instantly. She slowed her pace. Then she looked again. Printed clearly across the cover page was a name she recognized from internal reports, shareholder briefings, and executive presentations. Ethan Brooks. The analyst stopped walking. For a moment, she wondered if it could possibly be the same person. Then she remembered the photographs from annual reports. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked toward Richard's desk. then back toward Ethan. Suddenly, the quiet man sitting alone beside the fountain no longer looked like a rejected loan applicant. He looked like the beginning of a very serious problem. The analyst remained frozen for several seconds, her eyes locked on the name printed across the application folder. Ethan Brooks. She had seen that name countless times in executive briefings circulated throughout the bank's internal systems. Not because he was applying for loans. Quite the opposite. The name appeared in reports involving major institutional relationships, strategic investments, and high-level corporate partnerships. She looked again toward the waiting area. Ethan sat quietly beside the fountain, completely relaxed, as if he had nowhere else he needed to be. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the growing concern in her mind felt impossible to ignore. She quickly changed direction and headed toward a restricted employee corridor. Upstairs, managers and analysts moved through another ordinary business day. Phones rang. Reports were reviewed. Meetings continued. Nobody knew that a single name had just transformed a routine morning into something potentially career-altering. The analyst entered a glass-walled office where her supervisor was reviewing quarterly account summaries. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. The supervisor barely looked up. "Make it quick." She placed the application file on his desk. "I think you need to see this." He glanced down casually. Then his expression changed immediately. The room grew quiet. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Downstairs." "Who is handling it?" She hesitated. "Richard Collins." The supervisor slowly leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stood and walked toward the office door. "Come with me." Meanwhile, Ethan remained exactly where he was. Around him, customers came and went. Some carried mortgage paperwork. Others discussed retirement accounts. Several met with financial advisors. Ethan observed each interaction with the same patient curiosity. Every organization revealed its values through small moments. Not mission statements. Not advertising campaigns. Daily behavior. A young teller greeted elderly customers warmly. Another employee rushed to assist a struggling small business owner. There were positive moments happening throughout the branch. Yet Ethan also noticed something else. Certain customers received immediate attention because of assumptions people made about them. Others received skepticism before they spoke a single word. The pattern was subtle, but it existed. Across the lobby, Richard Collins continued moving confidently between meetings. He occasionally glanced toward the waiting area and seemed mildly irritated that Ethan had not left yet. To Richard, the situation was simple. A loan applicant had been rejected. End of story. What he did not know was that 2 floors above him, multiple employees were now reviewing records connected to Ethan Brooks. The supervisor entered a secure office suite and requested access to several internal databases. Minutes later, account summaries appeared on his screen. Strategic partnership files appeared. Investment records appeared. The more information he reviewed, the more concerned he became. Every document confirmed the same reality. Ethan Brooks was not an ordinary customer. He was connected to relationships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, his name appeared repeatedly in reports reviewed directly by senior leadership. The supervisor immediately picked up his phone. "I need Regional Director Melissa Grant in Conference Room 3. His tone left no room for questions. Within 15 minutes, several managers gathered around a conference table. Nobody spoke casually. Nobody smiled. The atmosphere felt noticeably different. Melissa Grant entered carrying a tablet and took one look at the documents spread across the table. "Tell me this is not what I think it is." The supervisor answered quietly. "I was hoping you would tell us the same thing." Melissa reviewed the files. Her expression hardened. "Has anyone informed Richard?" "Not yet." Melissa closed the folder. "Do not." Several people exchanged confused looks. She continued. "I want to understand exactly what happened before anyone says a word." Downstairs, Richard remained completely unaware of the growing concern. He was explaining investment products to another client when a junior manager approached him. "Everything okay?" Richard asked. "Fine." The manager replied quickly. The answer sounded forced. Richard noticed, but dismissed it. Ethan, however, noticed immediately. Small changes were beginning to ripple through the branch. Employees who previously ignored him now glanced in his direction. Managers appeared unusually distracted. Conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms. The atmosphere had shifted. Ethan smiled slightly. The discovery process had begun. He knew the sequence well. First, someone recognizes the name. Then records are checked. Then leadership becomes involved. Then questions start spreading through the organization. It happened every time assumptions collided with reality. Upstairs, Melissa continued reviewing documents. One report caused her to stop completely. She read it once, then again. Finally, she looked around the room. Does Richard have any idea who he spoke to? Nobody answered. The silence itself provided the answer. Melissa took a slow breath. Then we have a problem. Back in the lobby, sunlight reflected across the marble floor as Ethan calmly opened his folder and reviewed a few pages. Nearby customers saw nothing unusual. To them, he appeared to be another businessman waiting for an appointment. Yet hidden throughout the bank, alarms were quietly beginning to sound. Not electronic alarms. Institutional alarms. The kind that activate when people realize they may have made a very expensive mistake. And while Richard Collins continued believing he controlled the situation, senior leadership was rapidly discovering that the man sitting beside the fountain might have far more influence over the bank's future than the branch manager could possibly imagine. Upstairs, Conference Room 3 had become the center of a growing storm that most of the bank did not yet realize existed. Regional Director Melissa Grant stood at the head of the table reviewing document after document, while senior managers exchanged increasingly concerned looks. Every new report seemed to create more questions than answers. Ethan Brooks was not simply a successful entrepreneur. He was connected to investment groups, corporate partnerships, and strategic financial relationships that touched multiple divisions of the institution. Melissa opened another file and immediately recognized a familiar logo. It belonged to one of the largest technology holding companies in the country. Ethan's name appeared beside it. She opened another report. The pattern continued. One manager shook his head slowly. How did this get missed? Nobody answered because everyone knew the truth. Nothing had been missed. Nobody had bothered to look until now. Downstairs, Ethan remained seated beside the fountain, occasionally reviewing pages inside his application folder. His calmness continued to confuse employees. Several now knew something unusual was happening, but none possessed the full picture. The young analyst who first recognized his name watched from a distance. She noticed that Ethan never appeared worried. If anything, he looked curious. It was the expression of a man observing an experiment rather than waiting for approval. Across the lobby, Richard Collins completed another client meeting and headed toward the employee coffee station. As he poured himself a cup, two managers abruptly stopped talking when he approached. Richard frowned. Something wrong. One manager forced a smile. Just discussing reports. Richard accepted the explanation and walked away. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it planted a seed of discomfort. Throughout his career, Richard prided himself on reading people. Suddenly, people seemed determined not to be read. Back upstairs, Melissa accessed a restricted database normally reviewed only by executive leadership. Several managers gathered behind her chair. A list of strategic relationships appeared on the screen. Then a list of institutional investors. Then a list of major corporate partners. The room fell silent. Ethan Brooks appeared repeatedly, not as a borrower, not as a customer seeking assistance, as someone whose organizations conducted business with the bank on a scale far beyond anything occurring inside the local branch. Melissa stared at the screen. Richard thought he was denying a loan application. One executive laughed nervously. That is one way to describe what happened. Nobody found the situation amusing. Melissa continued scrolling through records. Then she stopped completely. Her expression changed. No. The room immediately became still. What is it? Someone asked. Melissa enlarged the document. A strategic governance report filled the screen. Several names appeared throughout the report, including Ethan Brooks. One manager leaned closer. That cannot be right. Melissa looked at him. It is. The room suddenly felt smaller. The implications extended far beyond a rejected application. Ethan's influence touched decisions made at levels of the organization few branch employees even knew existed. Downstairs, customers continued arriving and leaving. Business proceeded normally. A retired couple opened a savings account. A restaurant owner discussed expansion financing. A young family met with a mortgage advisor. The ordinary rhythm of banking continued uninterrupted. Yet beneath that normal surface, tension spread quietly through management ranks. Employees noticed unusual phone calls. Executives arriving unexpectedly. Conference rooms filling without explanation. Rumors began forming. Nobody understood the truth, but everyone sensed something important was unfolding. Ethan noticed it too. He glanced toward the upper floors and smiled slightly. The pattern remained predictable. Discovery always followed assumptions. First, people underestimated. Then they investigated. Then they learned. The sequence rarely changed. Richard finally returned to his office and opened his email. Several messages requested information regarding the earlier loan meeting. His irritation immediately returned. Why was everyone suddenly interested in a rejected application? He typed a short response explaining that the applicant did not meet expectations and that the matter was closed. Moments later, his phone rang. Melissa Grant. Richard sat up straighter. Regional directors rarely called branch managers directly. Melissa, he answered confidently. Her voice remained calm. Tell me exactly what happened this morning. Richard described the encounter. He emphasized his experience, his judgment, his assessment of the situation. Melissa listened without interruption. When he finished, silence filled the line for several seconds. Then she asked a simple question. Did you review the complete application? Richard hesitated. I reviewed enough to make a decision. Another pause followed. This one felt heavier. Finally, Melissa spoke. Do not make any further decisions regarding Mr. Brooks. Richard frowned. Why? Melissa looked through the conference room glass toward the executives gathered around the documents. Every face reflected the same growing concern. Because, she said carefully, I believe you may have misunderstood who was sitting across from you. As the call ended, Richard stared at the phone in confusion. For the first time all day, genuine uncertainty entered his mind. And several floors above him, leadership was beginning to realize that the man waiting quietly beside the fountain might hold more influence over the future of the bank than the branch manager who had just shown him the door. Richard Collins remained seated behind his desk long after the call ended. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was beginning to crack. Melissa Grant's words repeated inside his mind. You may have misunderstood who was sitting across from you. Richard looked through the glass walls of his office toward the lobby. Ethan Brooks remained beside the fountain, calm and patient, occasionally reviewing documents inside the same folder Richard had dismissed less than an hour earlier. For the first time, Richard studied him carefully. The tailored suit, the relaxed posture, the complete absence of frustration. None of it matched the image Richard had created in his head when Ethan first approached the lending desk. Yet pride is a difficult thing to abandon. Richard convinced himself there had to be another explanation. Perhaps Ethan knew someone important. Perhaps he represented a large client. Perhaps leadership was simply being overly cautious. Whatever the reason, Richard refused to believe he had made a serious mistake. Upstairs, however, the evidence continued to grow. Melissa Grant and several senior executives had expanded their review beyond account summaries and partnership reports. Historical files were now being retrieved from digital archives that most employees never accessed. The further they looked, the more surprising the story became. Ethan's name appeared alongside major expansion projects, strategic capital investments, emergency liquidity agreements, long-term governance initiatives. One executive leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. This relationship goes back nearly 12 years. Another executive nodded, and it became more significant every year. Melissa opened a confidential report prepared for board members. The room immediately fell silent. Several pages detailed the role Ethan and his companies had played during one of the most difficult periods in the bank's history. Years earlier, when economic conditions created uncertainty throughout the financial sector, many investors reduced exposure and stepped away from risk. Ethan had done the opposite. His organizations increased commitments, stabilized partnerships, supported growth initiatives when confidence was scarce. Melissa closed the report and looked around the room. Does Richard know any of this? Nobody answered because the answer was obvious. Richard had never bothered to learn it. Downstairs, Ethan noticed subtle changes spreading through the branch. Managers walked faster. Employees whispered more carefully. Several people who had ignored him earlier now glanced in his direction with visible curiosity. A teller carrying paperwork accidentally dropped a folder after recognizing his name from an internal message. Ethan smiled politely and helped gather the papers. The teller thanked him and hurried away, her face red with embarrassment. The entire atmosphere felt different now, not because anyone fully understood what was happening, but because uncertainty had entered the building. And uncertainty often spreads faster than facts. A few minutes later, Melissa received another file from corporate headquarters. She reviewed the first page and immediately stood. Get everyone in the executive conference room. One manager looked confused. Everyone. Melissa nodded. Now. Within 20 minutes, senior leadership from multiple divisions joined the meeting through secure video connections. Faces appeared on large screens mounted along the wall. Some participants were located hundreds of miles away. Others occupied offices in corporate headquarters. The situation had clearly moved beyond the local branch. Melissa summarized the morning's events. As she described Richard's interaction with Ethan, several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Then she presented the documentation: strategic relationships, historical investments, governance records. The deeper she went, the quieter the room became. Finally, one board representative who had remained silent throughout the meeting spoke. Is Ethan still in the building? Melissa nodded. He has not left. The representative exhaled slowly. That may be the most fortunate thing that happened today. The comment puzzled several people. Then he continued. Because if he had left, we would be dealing with a completely different problem. The room understood immediately. This was no longer about a rejected application. It was about trust, respect, judgment, reputation. Downstairs, Richard's phone rang again. This time it was not Melissa. It was the office of the bank's executive chairman. Richard stared at the caller identification for several seconds before answering. His pulse quickened. Branch managers did not receive direct calls from executive chairman. Richard, the voice said calmly, I need you to do something. Of course. Do not speak to Mr. Brooks again. Richard frowned. Sir, I think there has been a misunderstanding. That is exactly what concerns me. The line went silent for a moment. Then the chairman added something that drained the remaining confidence from Richard's face. A team from headquarters is already on its way. As the call ended, Richard slowly lowered the phone. Through the glass walls of his office, he could still see Ethan sitting peacefully beside the fountain. But now the scene looked completely different. Earlier, Richard believed he was looking at a rejected applicant. Now he was beginning to realize he might be looking at someone whose influence reached all the way to the highest levels of the institution. And while Ethan continued waiting with remarkable patience, executives across the organization were rapidly discovering a truth that would soon change everything inside the bank. The atmosphere inside First Dominion Bank changed dramatically over the next 30 minutes, even though most customers never realized it. To them, the branch appeared normal. Tellers processed transactions. Advisors conducted meetings. Phones continued ringing. Yet beneath the surface, executives across multiple levels of the organization were moving with increasing urgency. The arrival of a corporate response team from headquarters confirmed what many managers already suspected. This situation was no longer being treated as a routine customer service issue. It had become something much larger. Ethan Brooks remained seated beside the fountain, patient as ever. Several employees now recognized his name. Others recognized the attention surrounding him. Nobody approached him without a reason. Nobody interrupted him unnecessarily. The contrast with earlier that morning could not have been more obvious. What fascinated Ethan was not the change itself. It was the speed of the change. Hours earlier, people made assumptions with complete confidence. Now uncertainty had entered the room, and confidence was disappearing. Upstairs, Melissa Grant welcomed the headquarters team into the executive conference room. Among them was Daniel Mercer, the bank's chief governance officer. Daniel rarely traveled to local branches. His presence alone communicated the seriousness of the situation. As he reviewed the documentation, the room remained silent. Several executives watched his reactions carefully. Daniel read through historical investment records, then partnership agreements, then strategic governance files. Finally, he closed the folder and looked around the room. How much does Richard know? Melissa answered honestly. Very little. Daniel nodded. That may be for the best. One executive leaned forward. Can someone explain exactly why this situation is escalating so quickly? Daniel rested his hands on the table. Because most of you are looking at Ethan Brooks as a customer. The room listened carefully. He is not. Daniel opened another document and slid it across the table. Several executives immediately recognized the report. Others did not. The title alone was enough to create concern. Strategic Capital Preservation Agreement. Daniel continued. When this institution faced severe instability years ago, several parties stepped forward to help preserve long-term operations. He tapped the document. His organizations were among the most important. The room remained quiet. Daniel opened another file. Then there were the expansion initiatives. Another file followed. Then the infrastructure modernization projects. Another. Then the liquidity support arrangements. Every new document expanded the picture. Ethan's influence was not limited to one relationship. It existed throughout multiple chapters of the bank's modern history. Melissa watched several managers slowly realize the scale of what they were seeing. One executive finally asked the question everyone was thinking. How much influence does he actually have? Daniel looked around the room. More than most people here understand. The answer landed heavily. Downstairs, Richard Collins sat alone inside his office, staring through the glass walls. His earlier confidence had been replaced by growing anxiety. Nobody was telling him exactly what was happening, yet everyone was treating him differently. Conversations stopped when he approached. Meetings occurred without him. Executives arrived and ignored him completely. Richard hated uncertainty. For years, he had been the person making judgments. Now he felt like the subject of one. Across the lobby, Ethan noticed a black sedan pull into the reserved executive parking area outside. Several more followed. Additional senior leaders entered the building. The pattern continued unfolding exactly as expected. He glanced at his watch. Timing mattered. Institutions often revealed themselves under pressure. Today, the bank was revealing far more than it intended. Back upstairs, Daniel opened one final folder. Unlike the others, this file carried special access restrictions. Several managers immediately recognized the classification level. Melissa leaned forward. What is that? Daniel looked at her carefully before answering. The reason headquarters moved so quickly. He opened the file. Silence filled the room. Several executives exchanged shocked looks. One manager removed his glasses and stared at the page. Another leaned back in disbelief. Melissa read the document twice before speaking. Richard rejected a loan application from someone connected to this. Daniel nodded. Without reviewing the file, nobody spoke. The implications extended beyond poor judgment. This was a failure of process, a failure of professionalism, a failure of leadership. Most importantly, it exposed a deeper issue. Richard had not evaluated the application. He had evaluated the person standing in front of him. The room understood the distinction immediately. Daniel closed the folder. The executive chairman has already reviewed this situation. Several heads turned. Direct involvement from the chairman was extraordinarily rare. Daniel continued. A decision is being prepared. Melissa frowned slightly. A decision regarding what? Daniel met her eyes. Leadership. The room fell completely silent. Downstairs, Ethan calmly closed his folder and looked around the branch one more time. Employees hurried between offices. Managers checked phones repeatedly. Executives moved through corridors with unusual urgency. The building felt different now. Not because of him, because of what people had discovered about themselves. And while Richard Collins remained inside his office trying to understand why control was slipping away, the highest levels of the institution were already discussing a future in which he might no longer represent the bank at all. The next hour felt unlike anything First Dominion Bank had experienced in years. Executives moved through hallways with unusual urgency while carefully attempting to maintain the appearance of normal operations. Customers continued entering and leaving the branch, unaware that a series of conversations taking place behind closed doors were about to reshape careers. Ethan Brooks remained seated beside the fountain, composed and patient. He had not demanded attention. He had not raised his voice. He had not asked anyone to explain the sudden change in behavior around him. Instead, he simply waited. That patience was becoming increasingly difficult for others to understand. Inside the executive conference room, Daniel Mercer had just concluded a call with the executive chairman. Every person present watched him carefully as he lowered the phone. Melissa Grant spoke first. What did he say? Daniel took a slow breath. He wants Mr. Brooks brought upstairs immediately. Nobody objected. Nobody suggested another option. The decision was unanimous before it was spoken. The challenge was deciding who would approach Ethan. Earlier that morning, Richard Collins had dismissed him publicly. Now the bank needed to reverse course without creating an even larger problem. Melissa stood from her chair. I will do it myself. Several executives nodded. Minutes later, She stepped into the elevator and descended toward the lobby. The moment she entered the main floor, employees noticed. Regional directors did not normally visit local branches, and they certainly did not personally greet customers. Yet Melissa walked directly past lending offices, private meeting rooms, and service desks. Her destination was obvious. Ethan looked up as she approached. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice was respectful but measured. Ethan smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Melissa extended her hand. "I am Melissa Grant, Regional Director." Ethan shook it. "Pleasure to meet you." For a moment, neither spoke. The contrast between this interaction and the one Richard initiated earlier could not have been more striking. Melissa finally broke the silence. "I would like to apologize for your experience this morning." Ethan nodded but offered no immediate response. Melissa continued, "Our executive leadership team would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you privately." Ethan glanced around the lobby. Several employees were pretending not to watch. None were particularly convincing. "That sounds important." Melissa smiled slightly. "It is." Ethan closed his folder and stood. The simple movement seemed to send a ripple through the branch. Employees looked up from desks. Managers paused conversations. Even customers sensed something unusual was happening. Together, Ethan and Melissa walked toward the executive elevator. As they passed Richard's office, their eyes met briefly through the glass wall. Richard froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Earlier that day, he viewed Ethan as an applicant who could be dismissed without consideration. Now the regional director herself was escorting him upstairs. The realization hit harder than any explanation could. Ethan never looked away. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply continued walking. The elevator doors closed. Upstairs, the executive conference room fell silent as Ethan entered. Senior leaders stood immediately. Some recognized him from previous meetings and reports. Others only knew him through the documents they had spent hours reviewing. Either way, the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for meeting with us." Ethan took a seat at the conference table. "I understand there has been considerable activity since this morning." A few nervous smiles appeared around the room. Daniel nodded. "There has." Melissa sat beside him while several executives organized files and reports. Ethan noticed the stack of documents. Historical partnerships, strategic agreements, governance records. They had clearly done their homework. Daniel folded his hands. "Before we discuss anything else, we want to acknowledge that what happened this morning should not have happened." Ethan listened quietly. "We have reviewed the circumstances thoroughly," Daniel continued, "and we take them seriously." Ethan nodded. "Good." The response was calm, yet it carried enough weight to quiet the room again. Daniel exchanged a glance with Melissa before continuing. "There are relationships between your organizations and this institution that many people inside this branch clearly failed to understand." Ethan looked around the table. "That appears to be true." No one argued. Because the issue was no longer hidden. The executives had seen the records. They had traced the history. They now understood that the man sitting across from them was connected to the bank in ways most branch employees never imagined. Yet even as the apologies continued and explanations began, a deeper question remained unanswered. Why had Ethan come to the branch personally in the first place? And as the executives prepared to ask that question, none of them realized that the answer would change the direction of the entire conversation and place Richard Collins directly in the center of a decision that was already beginning to take shape. The question lingered in the conference room for several moments before anyone finally asked it. Daniel Mercer leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Brooks, there is something we do not understand." Ethan looked at him calmly. "Only one thing." A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Daniel nodded. "Why did you come here personally?" The room immediately became silent again. Everyone wanted the answer. After everything they had discovered throughout the day, that single question remained unresolved. Ethan rested his hands on the table and looked around the room. "Because I wanted to see something for myself." Several executives exchanged glances. Melissa spoke carefully. "What exactly?" Ethan looked through the glass wall toward the city skyline beyond the building. "Character." The answer surprised them. He continued. "For years, I have reviewed reports about customer experience, lending access, community engagement, and institutional culture. The numbers were always strong. The presentations were always impressive." He paused. "But numbers only tell part of the story. No one interrupted. Ethan continued. A few months ago, my team began reviewing opportunities for a major expansion initiative. We knew financing would eventually become part of the discussion. Rather than sending representatives, lawyers, or advisors, I decided to visit personally. Melissa frowned slightly. To evaluate the bank. Ethan nodded. Partially. The room became very quiet. Several executives suddenly realized that the loan application itself may never have been the central issue. Ethan continued. The application was real. The project was real. But the experience mattered just as much. Daniel looked at the documents spread across the table. And what did you discover? Ethan answered immediately. That some people still make decisions before they gather information. No one challenged the statement. No one could. The evidence was sitting in front of them. Richard Collins had not rejected financial data. He had rejected assumptions he created himself. Ethan continued. The most valuable institutions understand something simple. Every person who walks through the door deserves the same professional process. The same attention. The same respect. Melissa slowly nodded. Ethan looked around the room. When that process changes based on appearance, confidence, background, or personal assumptions, the institution begins making decisions with incomplete information. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. They knew he was talking about more than one branch manager. He was talking about culture. Daniel studied Ethan carefully. You could have revealed who you were immediately. Ethan smiled slightly. Of course. Why did you not? Ethan's answer came without hesitation. Because then I would have learned nothing. The room fell silent again. That response carried more weight than any accusation. If Ethan had introduced himself as a powerful executive connected to major strategic partnerships, every interaction would have changed instantly. The real test would have disappeared. Melissa looked down briefly before speaking. Then today showed you something disappointing. Ethan considered the statement. It showed me something important. The distinction mattered. Disappointment could be ignored. Important lessons could not. Daniel folded his hands. There is something you should know. Ethan nodded. Go ahead. Daniel took a slow breath. The executive chairman has already reviewed the situation. A decision is being prepared regarding Richard Collins. Several people around the table became very still. Ethan's expression did not change. Daniel continued. His conduct this morning does not reflect our standards. Ethan listened quietly. And Daniel seemed surprised by the question. And leadership believes accountability is necessary. Ethan leaned back slightly. Accountability and punishment are not always the same thing. The room absorbed the comment. Melissa looked at him carefully. Are you suggesting no action should be taken? Ethan shook his head. I am suggesting the organization should focus on the actual problem. Several executives listened closely. Ethan continued. If one manager can make assumptions like that, the question is not whether one manager failed. The question is whether the system allowed the failure to happen. Nobody answered. Because it was the question they had been avoiding all afternoon. Ethan looked around the room. You can replace one person tomorrow. That is easy. He paused. Changing culture is harder. Daniel slowly nodded. The conversation had moved beyond a single employee. It had become a discussion about leadership itself. At that moment, a message appeared on Melissa's tablet. She reviewed it quickly. Her expression changed immediately. Daniel noticed. What is it? Melissa looked up. The executive chairman has finalized his decision. The room instantly grew silent. Every executive understood the significance. Melissa read the message again before speaking. Richard Collins has been removed from his management role effective immediately, pending formal review. No one reacted. No one celebrated. The moment felt too serious for that. Ethan remained calm. He simply nodded once. Across the building, Richard still sat inside his office, unaware that the decision had already been made. Years of authority had vanished with a single executive directive. Yet as the room absorbed the news, Ethan's attention remained focused elsewhere. He was not thinking about Richard. He was thinking about the institution itself. Because the larger question remained unanswered. Would the bank merely remove one manager and move on? Or would it finally confront the deeper issues that allowed the situation to happen in the first place? The answer to that question would determine whether today's events became a temporary embarrassment or the beginning of a genuine transformation. The announcement spread through executive channels within minutes. Richard Collins had been removed from his management position pending formal review, and the decision immediately became the defining topic throughout the organization. Yet inside the executive conference room, the discussion moved in a different direction. Ethan Brooks had made something very clear. One personnel decision would not solve a cultural problem. If the bank truly wanted to learn from what happened, it needed to examine the system itself. Daniel Mercer understood that better than anyone. He looked around the table and spoke carefully. Mr. Brooks is right. Several executives nodded. Daniel continued. We can address individual accountability today. The larger question is whether our procedures encourage objective evaluation or personal assumptions. Melissa Grant opened a notebook and began writing. For the first time all day, the conversation shifted away from crisis management and toward reform. Ethan listened quietly. He had no interest in watching people scramble to protect themselves. What interested him was whether they were capable of learning. One executive cleared his throat. What changes would you recommend? Ethan smiled slightly. That depends. The executive looked confused. On what? Ethan folded his hands. Whether you want better public relations or better outcomes. The room became silent again. It was a simple question, but an important one. Public relations could be fixed with statements. Outcomes required action. Daniel nodded slowly. We want better outcomes. Ethan looked around the table. Then start measuring process, not just results. Several executives began taking notes. Ethan continued. Most organizations track approvals, revenue, growth, customer retention, but very few track how decisions are actually made. Melissa immediately understood. You mean identifying patterns before they become problems? Ethan nodded. Exactly. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Lending procedures, customer evaluation standards, management training, escalation protocols, internal accountability systems. The deeper they went, the more opportunities for improvement they discovered. What began as a crisis meeting gradually evolved into something far more constructive. Meanwhile, on the lower floors of the building, employees sensed that significant changes were coming. Nobody knew every detail, but everyone knew enough to understand that the institution was entering a different chapter. Richard's office remained closed. Managers spoke more carefully. Employees reviewed procedures they had not examined in years. The ripple effects had already begun. Later that afternoon, Daniel received authorization from the executive chairman to move forward with immediate reforms. Several initiatives that previously would have required months of discussion were approved within hours. New customer review standards, enhanced management oversight, expanded bias awareness training, independent audit procedures. The speed surprised many people. Ethan did not seem surprised at all. He had spent his career watching organizations respond to pressure. The best ones treated difficult moments as opportunities. The worst ones treated them as inconveniences. First Dominion appeared determined to become the first type. As the meeting approached its conclusion, Melissa looked toward Ethan. There is one thing I still do not understand. Ethan smiled. Only one. A few people laughed softly. Melissa returned the smile. You could have escalated the situation immediately. You could have called executives directly. You could have bypassed the branch entirely. Ethan nodded. I could have. Why did you not? Ethan looked out the window toward the city. For several moments he remained silent. Then he answered. Because institutions reveal their character when nobody thinks they are being observed. The room absorbed the statement. Ethan continued. Anyone can behave correctly when they know a powerful person is watching. No one disagreed. The real test is what happens when they believe nobody important is in the room. Daniel slowly nodded. That observation explained everything. The morning had never been about securing a loan. It had been about discovering whether the institution lived according to the values it promoted. Some employees had passed that test. Others had not. As evening approached, executives prepared to leave the conference room. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different from the panic that existed earlier in the day. The crisis had exposed weaknesses, but it had also created an opportunity to address them. Before standing, Daniel turned toward Ethan. There is something else you should know. Ethan looked at him. Go ahead. Daniel smiled slightly. The executive chairman would like to meet with you personally. Ethan raised an eyebrow. About the financing project? Daniel shook his head. Partly. And the other part? Daniel exchanged a glance with Melissa before answering. He believes your perspective could help shape the future direction of the institution. Several executives nodded in agreement. Ethan remained thoughtful. Earlier that morning, He walked into the branch as a customer seeking a professional evaluation. Now, less than a day later, the highest levels of leadership were asking him to help influence the future of the bank itself. Yet even then, Ethan did not appear triumphant. He appeared reflective, because the most important outcome had never been about authority or influence. It was about whether people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and become better because of them. And as the sun began setting beyond the city skyline, First Dominion Bank stood at a crossroads. The next decisions would determine whether today's lessons were remembered for a few weeks or whether they would become the foundation for lasting change throughout the entire organization. 3 months later, the changes inside First Dominion Bank were impossible to miss. What began as a single uncomfortable morning had evolved into one of the most significant institutional reforms in the company's recent history. New customer evaluation procedures had been implemented across every regional branch. Management training programs had been expanded. Independent review systems now monitored lending decisions to ensure consistency and fairness. The organization that existed today looked noticeably different from the one Ethan Brooks had walked into that morning. Yet the most remarkable transformation was not found in policies or procedures. It was found in mindset. Employees spoke differently. Managers asked better questions. Leaders paid closer attention to how decisions were made rather than simply measuring outcomes. The culture itself had begun to change. Ethan continued monitoring the progress from a distance. He never requested a special title. He never sought public recognition. He never used the situation to elevate his personal reputation. Instead, he focused on the expansion project that originally brought him to the bank. The financing partnership moved forward successfully, supporting new technology centers, workforce development programs, and economic initiatives in communities often overlooked by major investors. The project generated jobs. It attracted new businesses. It created opportunities for thousands of families. In many ways, it became a symbol of what could happen when organizations focused on potential rather than assumptions. One afternoon, Ethan returned to First Dominion Bank for a scheduled meeting with the executive chairman. Unlike his previous visit, no confusion accompanied his arrival. Employees greeted him warmly. Customers moved through the lobby. Business continued normally. Yet Ethan noticed something interesting. The atmosphere felt more professional than before, not because people recognized him, because employees appeared committed to treating everyone with equal attention. That observation mattered more than any personal recognition could have. As he crossed the lobby, the young analyst who first recognized his name approached him. She smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan smiled back. "Good afternoon." She hesitated briefly. "I wanted to thank you." Ethan looked curious. "For what?" "For not letting the situation become only about one person." Ethan understood immediately. She was talking about Richard Collins. Over the months following his removal from management, internal reviews revealed additional concerns regarding decision-making practices. The organization addressed those issues and moved forward. Yet Ethan had consistently redirected attention toward broader improvement rather than personal blame. The analyst continued. "A lot of people learned from what happened." Ethan nodded. That was always the goal. Upstairs, the executive chairman welcomed Ethan into a conference room overlooking the city. The view stretched for miles beneath a bright afternoon sky. After discussing the expansion project, the chairman turned the conversation toward the bank itself. "I wanted you to see the results." He handed Ethan a report. The document summarized the reforms implemented throughout the institution. Customer satisfaction improved. Lending consistency improved. Employee engagement improved. Community partnerships expanded. Ethan reviewed the numbers quietly. The chairman smiled. "You were right." Ethan looked up. "About what?" "One person was never the real issue." Ethan closed the report. "Most problems are larger than the people who expose them." The chairman nodded thoughtfully. For several moments, both men looked through the windows toward the city beyond. Finally, the chairman spoke again. "Do you regret coming here that day?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Not anymore." The answer carried years of experience. Difficult moments often reveal important truths. Without that morning, the institution might never have confronted weaknesses hiding beneath strong performance metrics. Without that morning, meaningful change might never have happened. As the meeting concluded, Ethan returned to the lobby one final time. He paused beside the same fountain where he had spent hours waiting months earlier. Families opened accounts. Small business owners met with advisors. Retirees discussed financial planning. Students explored internship opportunities. Life moved forward. Yet one thing stood out. Every customer appeared to receive the same professional attention regardless of appearance, age, background, or circumstance. Ethan watched quietly for several minutes. Then he smiled. Not because the institution had become perfect. No organization ever does. He smiled because people were trying. Real improvement begins when people are willing to examine uncomfortable truths honestly. As Ethan walked toward the exit, sunlight streamed through the glass entrance exactly as it had on the morning everything began. The building looked the same. The logo looked the same. The marble floors looked the same. Yet the institution itself had changed. Outside, Ethan paused for one last glance before continuing toward the city. The lesson from that day was simple. Respect should never depend on titles. Dignity should never depend on status. And the most powerful leaders are often the ones who do not need to announce their power at all. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving people wrong. Sometimes it is helping an entire institution become better because of what it learned. And as First Dominion Bank continued building its future, that lesson remained long after the headlines disappeared.